Ready? Awesome. So yes, we're recording this panel. It's going to be really excellent, and we want to make sure to make it available not just to folks here, but who might want to watch it asynchronously. But thank you all so much for being here tonight, because it's also so great to have some folks joining us live. I am going to introduce the organizations that have been putting on this series, and then also our panelists. My name is Eva Borgwardt. I'm the political director at If Not Now, and we are so excited to have you all here. This is the fourth and final event of our speaker series, Who Speaks for the Jews? And the series is a collaboration between If Not Now and the Jewish Liberation Fund. And our goal has been to dive deep into some big questions about power in the Jewish community. Who holds it, how they got it, how they use it, and what we can do as members of the Jewish progressive movement. If Not Now, for those of you who don't know, is a movement of American Jews organizing the Jewish community to end US support for Israel's apartheid system and demand equality, justice, and a thriving future for all Palestinians and Israelis. And I'm extremely grateful to the Jewish Liberation Fund, especially my co-conspirator, the real Jordan Mann. And I'm going to hand it over to Jordan to introduce the JLF.
Hi, everyone. Believe it or not, my name actually is Jordan Mann. Unlike many of the people who are here, although if there is another Jordan Mann, I welcome you. The Jewish Liberation Fund is a progressive philanthropic organization dedicated to resourcing and sustaining the progressive Jewish movement. We do that through making grants to a lot of small grassroots and growing progressive organizations in the Jewish progressive space who are doing a lot of awesome work and often overlooked by a lot of mainstream philanthropic organizations, as well as trying to remove red lines around a lot of the things, whether it happens to be Israel, Palestine, oil, or a lot of the different things that a lot of larger Jewish funders have red lines on. It's been really awesome putting together and being a part of this series with everyone. Just learning about what was the importance of philanthropic reform for movement building, the power structures that affect the way data gets created in American Jewry, and the impact of philanthropy on discourse surrounding anti-Semitism. And I think it's going to be really powerful and exciting to learn from our panelists today about one of those topics that's really under the, really kind of like under the influences of a lot of those. It's a great example that we're all really familiar with, that's really hotly contested and controversial, and really under the influences of a lot of those different factors that we don't think about all the time. So really excited to pass it back to Eva to introduce our panelists. They're awesome, and I can't wait to learn with you all.
Awesome, thanks, Jordan. So yeah, this panel is called Israel, Palestine, and the Future of American Jewish Politics. And I'm so excited to be here with you all tonight for this extremely important and timely conversation. If you've been following any political primaries, honestly, in like the past many election cycles, you'll have seen the incredibly bizarre role that Israel and Palestine plays in American politics more broadly. And this cycle in particular, there's been a lot of coverage, increasing coverage on the extent to which the scale of spending, particularly by AIPAC, Democratic Majority for Israel, Pro-Israel America, and a lot of groups that have different names but share like many funders contributing to them. The scale of the spending this cycle in particular is staggering. And there's been a lot of reporting in the mainstream media, not just the Jewish media, on the effect that that's having in many different primaries this cycle. And so while there have always been people who want to frame Israel as the #1 issue that American Jews care about, the scale of spending by pro-Israel lobbying groups this cycle has really made it everyone's problem. And I'm so excited to be here with our panelists tonight because tonight we're going to be able to go into some questions that can broaden our perspective beyond this specific cycle and situate this dynamic both in time in terms of a history of how we got here and some thoughts about what that means for the future, as well as in the broader landscape of what else is happening in the American Jewish community around this political spending at the grassroots level, at the institutional level, and continuing with the ongoing running theme of this series that Jordan mentioned, how philanthropy shapes those dynamics and what that says about who has power in Jewish politics, seeing philanthropy as one expression of power. So we have two great panelists tonight who are going to share with us, and we'll hopefully have some time for Q&A around 7:45 p.m., 7:50. For anyone who missed it, or just as a reminder, if you have questions while folks are speaking or afterward, feel free to direct message them to Jordan Mann. Again, since many people are named Jordan Mann, please DM him to his name, which is Questions. So if you search people you can send a direct message to, Jordan's name is Questions, DM me. So that's how you can submit questions. And then we'll select a couple at the end around 7:45, 7:50 for our panelists to answer. Also, if you have a tech issue, Jordan, AKA Questions, DM me, is on tech support tonight. So feel free to send a message and we'll get you sorted out. Okay, so excited to introduce our panelists. First, Dr. Sarah Anne Minkin works at the intersection of human and civil rights advocacy, philanthropy, and education with a focus on Israel-Palestine. She is the Director of Programs and Partnerships at the Foundation for Middle East Peace, also known as FMEP, and co-founder of the Palestinian Voices Study Group, which is an experiment in which Jews come together to engage in Palestinian texts in order to understand Palestinian perspectives and experiment with centering Palestinian voices. She earned her PhD in sociology from UC Berkeley, focusing on the sociology of emotion, nationalism, and Jewish Americans' relationships with Israel-Palestine. She is also a trained community mediator and a chaplain in training and is calling in from Oakland, California tonight. Professor Dov Waxman is the Rosalind and Arthur Gilbert Foundation Chair of Israel Studies at UCLA and the director of the UCLA YNS Nazarian Center for Israel Studies. His research focuses on the conflict over Israel-Palestine, Israeli politics and foreign policy, US-Israel relations, American Jewry's relationship with Israel, Jewish politics, and contemporary anti-Semitism. He is the author of 4 books, including Trouble in the Tribe, The American Jewish Conflict over Israel, and most recently, The Israeli-Palestinian Conflict, What Everyone Needs to Know. So thank you so much to both of our panelists. And I'm excited to get started. So I love, Dov, if you wanted to start and maybe give us an overview just by way of framing about like how you would describe the current American Jewish conversation on Israel-Palestine, how it's different today than it was in the past, and how you see it changing in the future.
Okay, thank you, Eva. Well, thank you for having me on, and it's a pleasure to be here to talk about this topic. So I'll try and avoid giving a lengthy history lecture, and I'll give a very kind of abbreviated summary of how the conversation around Israel has shifted over time. So to begin with, I guess, you know, the first, let's say, 25 years of Israel's existence after 1948, there really was very little conversation around Israel within the American Jewish community. Israel was just not a major focus of American Jewish politics for the first 25 years. American Jews were focused on a whole load of other issues. It was only really, you know, from the late 1960s, from the 1970s on, that the conversation around Israel really begins. I think, you know, we can talk about this. The formation of Brera in the early 1970s was, I think, a turning point in beginning to have a real conversation within the American Jewish community about Israel. And that conversation from the 1970s through until quite recently grew and grew. It became increasingly, it became more open as more people entered the conversation. This is a conversation that I think was initially, you know, dominated by a small number of voices, dominated primarily by major organizations who really kind of shaped the message and framed the conversation. And I think over time, you could say in a way it became more democratized as more people entered the conversation. And not only did more people enter the conversation, but it became increasingly open. It went beyond the kind of conference rooms of American Jewish organizations and increasingly into the public sphere. And it also became over time increasingly acrimonious. So as we all know, and probably many of us have experienced, particularly over the last decade or so, it really became a less of a conversation and more of a shouting match, if there was any sort of interaction at all. In terms of the substance of that conversation, I think it focused really on two main issues. One was the question of the future of the occupied territories. the territories that Israel occupied in 1967 and the question of land for peace. And of course, that became a particularly major issue during the Oslo peace process in the 1990s, but even during the Second Intifada, the question of land for peace and whether Israel should withdraw from the occupied territories, that was, I think, the dominant question. And that, as it was the dominant question in Israeli politics as well for those decades as well. In American Jewish politics, alongside that question was another question, which was, to put it simply, how should American Jews support Israel? The assumption, the guiding assumption was that American Jews supported Israel. And this assumption was well-founded, that the vast majority of the American Jewish community were attached to Israel, identified with Israel, supported Israel. So the question was, how could they support Israel? And in particular, could they criticize Israel? Could they criticize Israeli government policies? Could they do so in public? Was such criticism permissible for Jewish Americans who were pro-Israel? So in many ways, over the last 2 decades, the big question was, what it means to be pro-Israel. Does being pro-Israel entail uncritical support for Israel in public, publicly backing Israel, refraining from public criticism, or could it allow for public criticism of Israel? That debate, which dominated the American Jewish conversation for the last really half century, as I said, the way I think it beginning in the 1970s, the early 70s, and continuing since then, I think now that's no longer the major issue. I think today and going forward, there isn't any longer an American Jewish conversation. There are American Jewish conversations. We've fragmented into increasingly, different communities. There isn't a kind of single communal conversation dominated by, the question of how American Jews should support Israel. Instead, I think the conversation is fractured into smaller communities. So on the right of the American Jewish community, which is not having a conversation at all with those on the left of the American Jewish community, or even really very much with those in the center, on the right, the conversation is, the same one that has been for a long time: how to protect Israel from its enemies, how to fight back against the delegitimization of Israel as they see it, how to combat the antisemitism as they see it directed against Israel. That's one conversation, and that's a conversation that's happening on the right. On the left, I think the conversation is no longer about should Israel withdraw from the occupied territories, or the land for peace, or even the feasibility of a two-state solution, which has been the dominant issues over the last 2 decades. The question is increasingly about the very character of Israel itself, namely over Zionism itself. And what does it mean? And what if a two-state solution is no longer feasible, as I think many on the left have now concluded? What next? What does it mean for activism vis-a-vis Israel-Palestine? And what does it mean for trying to, what kind of vision or outcome should Jews on the left be hoping for? And what kind of strategies should they adopt? So that's, I think, the conversation happening on the left. Again, in complete separation from the conversation on the right, needless to say, and in the center, which once dominated the conversation, but I think now it's actually the left and right that are louder in many ways than those on the center. There is, I think, less of a conversation and more of a kind of agonizing over, this feeling of being squeezed on both sides. And, does liberal Zionism have a future? How can we identify with Israel and have our children and grandchildren identify with Israel if a two-state solution is no longer possible? If Israel is seen as an apartheid state, for example. So I think the conversation there remains more about how do we engage with Israel, remain attached to Israel, identify with Israel, given the trends that are happening both in America and in Israel. So really, I think Israel, the issue of Israel, continues to dominate American Jewish conversations. It continues to be the big issue, but increasingly, I think we are fragmented into different conversations, and there's really no longer any attempt, any effort to even have a communal conversation. Essentially, I think there's been a kind of essentially a schism within the American Jewish community over Israel today.
Well, thank you so much for that overview. And there's definitely a lot to get into in there. And yeah, really appreciate you starting us off. And Sarah Ann, I want to turn to you and ask about specifically the role of philanthropy in these dynamics and how donor money around communal initiatives, education, and other things like that translate to national Jewish institutions and American Jewish politics. And also if there's anything that you want to like reframe about the way that you see the landscape, also feel free.
Thank you so much for holding this conversation. Also, if not now in JLF, this is so great. I'm so glad that we're here, and I already see the time, and I know that we already don't have enough time for everything we want to talk about, but I'm so glad that we're getting started and that here we are. And for everyone who is tuning in and hasn't listened to the prior programs in this series, the whole series is excellent. So I highly recommend it. So thank you again, and thank you for having me. And I really appreciate what Dov just said, that we are so fragmented that there's no longer one conversation, but now there are multiple conversations. And I agree with him, except I think that there still is very much hegemonic power in the Jewish community, the Jewish communities. What do I mean by hegemonic power? There are still institutions and organizations that are taken to speak for the Jews, and to whom or to which we turn, so many of us reflexively, as these are the mainstream Jewish organizations, these are the ones who represent Jews in America. What we know is that they generally don't actually represent Jews in America. If we think about the ADL, if we think about the AJC, if we think about the Jewish federations, if you look at who they represent, and if you look at the numbers of Jews who actually agree with their agendas and agree with the values that they are promoting and perpetuating through their programming, then we can see that what they are in many cases doing is promoting the voices of groups of their donors, but not broadly Jewish Americans. What does that mean in terms of how that shapes Jewish communal agendas? And Eva, your question about how does money in our community translate into initiatives and education and what things look like? I want to make like 3 big points. And these are big points, and then we can unpack them further if we want to. So the first is that to be right-wing in our community is to be automatically taken as being more Jewish, automatically taken for granted to be accepted as being more Jewish or more concerned with Jewish life or Jewish welfare. To be left-wing is to be automatically suspect, that maybe you care about other people as much as you care about Jews, and that is suspect. How do we know this? There are lots of ways to unpack that, but I'm asking you to go with me that I'm saying it as a truth. We can go deeper into it. One of the ways is that we have in all of our community institutions the exclusion of groups of people or voices that are taken as suspect for the attention that they pay to Palestinian liberation or Palestinian oppression. In many cases, that kind of exclusion or marginalization, it happens quietly behind the scenes. In other cases, it's very explicit. Around 10 years ago, the San Francisco Federation formally codified guidelines for all of their grantees with regard to the state of Israel. And one of the guidelines that they codified said that they will not fund any efforts that, and now I'm quoting, advocate for or endorse undermining the legitimacy of Israel as a secure, independent, democratic Jewish state, including through participation in the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement in whole or in part. And I did a lot of interviews with people who were involved in this process and asked them whether or not they saw efforts from the right to expand Greater Israel, to expand settlements as potentially threatening Israel as a, quote, secure, independent, democratic Jewish state. And none of them did. None of them ever did, because efforts from the right are taken as affirming Israel and as affirming Jews. Efforts from the left are suspect. So what we have is exclusion of group, exclusion of voices because of their connections to Palestinians, because of their, even if they're not particularly connected to Palestinians, but they're critical of Israel. And these voices are excluded, and then people who engage with Jewish community, with educational initiatives or with any Jewish community institution don't even know what voices are already excluded. They're just left out and we don't even know. And then the impact is that there's a chilling effect for everyone else. And this, I think, is one of the great effects of donor priorities, which is that even on this call, we have people who are very active with incredible social justice organizations that are focused on domestic politics in the US. Jewish social justice organizations that will not touch the issue of Israel-Palestine because they can't, because there will be such a cost with their donors. And if you talk to the staff quietly, when they're not on a Zoom screen, they will talk to you about how frustrating that is for them, how difficult it is for them. They are continuing to perpetuate what we call progressive except for Palestine, which is the idea that you can have politics that are progressive but leave out Palestine, and that you should do that, that is desirable. And many of the people who are stuck in this place where they are forced to be progressive except for Palestine, where they're doing domestic Jewish politics, are doing that because of the chilling effect, because of donor funding, of efforts that silence Jews who speak out either in criticism of Israel or for Palestinian rights. That's how I would answer that question. And I'll just throw in one last piece, if I may, which is that Eva, you just spoke about, when you started, about the incredible amounts of money that AIPAC and DMFI, the Democratic Majority for Israel, have spent in this election cycle. Peter Beinart has a great article that came out last week in Jewish Currents. I really recommend everyone read it, which goes in depth about what this funding looks like and what its impact has been. And one of the things that he also talks about in that article is that there is a chilling effect even on our political candidates, that the expectation now is that political candidates will no longer speak out in criticism of Israel, or really of the US's sponsorship of Israel's violations of Palestinian rights. Political candidates won't speak out on that for fear of being targeted. So basically, they'll only speak out if they're running unopposed, or, well, who knows? We'll see. So this chilling effect, I think, is real. It happens inside the Jewish community, and it happens more broadly in our politics.
Thank you so much. And really, really excited for the rest of this conversation. And thanks to both of you for starting us off with a lot to think about. I think I want to dig into a little bit like what we're seeing in terms of something that Sarah Ann was just mentioning in terms of the relationship between the conversation or conversations in the Jewish community and what's happening in American politics. And just as one example, in terms of just like polling of just like American Jews more broadly, 58% of American Jews said it would be appropriate to restrict aid to Israel, so it could not spend US money on settlements. And that was a survey commissioned by the Jewish Electorate Institute last summer in 2021. So a policy like that, restricting aid from US aid to not go toward violations of human rights or toward Israeli settlements, with 58% support, why hasn't this translated to Jewish institutions and politicians? And I'm curious also, just in terms of some of the dynamics I think that both of you were talking about, but especially Dov, I really heard this in your opening remarks, that some of the dynamics that we've been talking about are similar to what's happening in American politics more broadly. Where we're sort of here, it feels more polarized and it feels more fractured. And on this too, there are plenty of issues with much broader popular support than translates into our politics. And I'm curious in what ways the way in which those dynamics play out in the Jewish community might be similar or different than the way they play out in American politics more broadly.
Okay, thank you for that question. So I think Sarah Ann introduced a very important point about paying attention to power, right? Like I do think, and I stand by my comment, that I think the conversation has opened up, and I somewhat take issue with Sarah Ann's argument that these Jewish mainstream organizations retain their hegemony. I think actually we're seeing the erosion of that hegemony. And I think there is gradually a shift. I don't think they're as quite as powerful as they once were, nor do I think that they are able to be the gatekeepers of the conversation in the way that they once were, or to silence or suppress the conversation or criticism as they were. Now, that's not to say none of that happens, but I do think there is a shift in those dynamics. And that's allowed for a kind of opening up of the American Jewish conversation around Israel. But I think nevertheless, Sarah's absolutely right. We still have to pay attention to the fact that it's not just what's happening on the grassroots, it's how people's beliefs and attitudes get translated into outcomes. I'm a political scientist, and we know, it's institutions matter, right? It's not just a question of what people think or want, but how public preferences gets translated via intermediaries, via institutions. And then we have to look at how those institutions are structured and whether they empower certain groups rather than others. And everybody in the United States is paying a lot more attention to how the American political system, the institutions of American politics, end up having effectively empower, white rural Christian Americans, essentially, and how that then distorts the outcomes, this distorts the kinds of policies that we see the US government adopting. And I think that's true also in the American Jewish context, that the major institutions which retain, I think, a greater influence in American politics, broadly speaking, in the American public sphere than in the Jewish public sphere. But yeah, that they are not entirely responsive to this shift in Jewish public opinion. They're not representative institutions. They are representative of their members. They're representative of those who show up. So I think there's fundamentally a kind of democratic deficit, if you like, because these institutions are not designed, nor do they really, although they may claim to speak on behalf of Jewish Americans, in reality, they speak for their members, and not even all of their members, but those who, show up and particularly donate. So I think, again, the issue that Sarah mentioned is absolutely right to think about the role that money plays and the role that donors play. And clearly in American Jewish life, in American Jewish politics, major donors have an outsized influence. It's not controversial to acknowledge this, on American Jewish politics and on the public positions of organizations within the mainstream. And we see clearly that is reflected in American politics more broadly. Money, private money, not public funds, dominate and have a disproportionate impact on outcomes. So I think I think there are shifts in public opinion, both in American politics vis-a-vis Israel, Palestine, and in Jewish politics, but that doesn't translate into changes in what organizations or politicians demand, because they're not actually representing the majority opinion. They're representing those who are either most empowered, either donors, or most vocal. And we see, for example, you take, the issue of gun control, right? Gun safety. We see that clearly it's not what the majority of Americans want, but the minority who are most mobilized, the single issue voters. And it's true in Jewish politics as well. Single issue voters, those who are most committed, typically on the right, the most mobilized, exercise a disproportionate impact. So I think paying attention, as you're doing today, and talking about not just public opinion, but how that translates into outcomes, and particularly how that may be distorted by the ways that institutions are structured, and particularly the funding model, is very important. And until there's really a reform in that, I think there is going to be a gap between where the public opinion is and the positions of organizations and institutions. But I do think there is a shift, and we're even seeing that in terms of funding. I mean, if not now, as an example of that, right? So you can see the emergence of newer grassroots organizations in American politics and in American Jewish politics that I think are showing that there's new models of fundraising, that don't rely on large donors to the same extent. And there's new ways of getting your voice out there through social media that don't rely on the megaphones of major institutions. So in broadly speaking, major institutions, whether they're political parties or mainstream American Jewish organizations, are gradually, very slowly, maybe not quickly, too slowly for some, losing their hegemony. And I think as a result, that is shifting. But at the moment, we're in a kind of transitional phase where these organizations still are powerful, but no longer able to kind of control the conversation in the way that they once were.
Wow, thank you so much for that. And really excited to get into a little bit more toward the end of this. What's on the other side of that transitional phase. But before we do that, I want to turn to you, Sarah Ann, to just ask one more question about unpacking one last aspect of the stakes of the circumscription of the communal conversation and the dynamics that we're talking about. And that's to ask, what does that mean we're missing? And what's left out when the communal conversation is circumscribed in the way that it's been? And then in terms of this fracturing and the multiple conversations that are popping up, are there places that you've seen the things we're not allowed to talk about emerge into the general discourse anyway, the things that are beyond the Federation guidelines or the other institutional parameters, whether around anti-Semitism, Zionism, other topics. Yeah, would love to take that to you.
Thank you. Eva, you're asking such big questions. These are great questions. These are huge questions. And they're great. They're so important. And so I think the first thing to say is actually, and this is now also in response to what Dov just said, that the old organizations can't gatekeep in the ways that they once could. I think that that's true. We have had, and we are living in this great moment of a strong, vibrant Jewish left, of which, if not now in the Jewish Liberation Fund, are clearly a part, clearly both products and creators of the vibrancy of this Jewish left, which is so wonderful. And of course, didn't originate the Jewish left, are inheritors of people who have been building this for so long. And some of the people I know on this call have been doing this work for many, many decades also. And so, yes, we have more space now than we did before, but the backlash is more ferocious than it was before. And so if it used to be that there were only certain ways that you were allowed to talk about Israel and stay inside of a Jewish space, now what we're facing is legal codification of definitions of anti-Semitism across the US in many states, and actually being codified beyond the state house level, potentially on the federal level, in many institutions, and throughout Europe and in other countries also, definitions of anti-Semitism that include criticism of Israel as anti-Semitism. Not all criticism of Israel, certain types of criticism of Israel, but certainly criticism of Israel that is absolutely legitimate and not anti-Semitic is now being codified into policy and into law, such that it can be, people will feel the burden of legal ramifications for speaking out against Israel's violations of Palestinian rights, or for speaking out just for Palestinian rights. That is a kind of backlash that we should all be terrified and mobilized around. That is something that we all need to be active around. So Eva, you asked, like, what gets left out and what's happening? We have this, what's the word I'm using? Basically this redefinition of anti-Semitism to include criticism of Israel, which means that at this moment, when there is so much anti-Semitism that is arising and is blatant in this country. And I just want to say that 2 of the last mass shooters both had uploaded Nazi imagery to 4chan, to their social media. This may or may not be being reported as these were anti-Semitic attacks, but we know that an important piece of white nationalism is anti-Semitism. So now we have armed, blatant anti-Semites who are racists and anti-queer and anti-trans, and we have this now in the country. At this moment, at this exact moment, we don't actually have the tools that we need for understanding anti-Semitism, because our communal leaders are so busy quashing criticism of Israel and quashing advocacy for Palestinian rights. So that is the first place, Eva, that I would go to talk about what is being silenced and what is emerging. And then I'll just say one other piece, which is that I think it's really, really important to think about anti-Palestinian racism. Anti-Palestinian racism, for so many of us, is it's the air that we breathe without even knowing it. It's something that we take for granted because we live in communities where Palestinians are not even trusted to narrate their own stories, where when they speak about their experiences, we are so conditioned and socialized to automatically question the veracity of what they tell us and to automatically question or disbelieve them, Palestinians, as the narrators of their own lives. And I could give you countless examples of Palestinians being accused of faking their own suffering or of lying or of making something up because it becomes yet another way that they can stick it to Israel. And I think that we are challenged, all of us, this is as individuals and as communities, and here I say communities in the way that Dov is using it, we're all in multiple communities, to really think about how we can counter anti-Palestinian racism, how we can teach ourselves to listen to Palestinians with empathy, with openness, to experiment with it, even when it's uncomfortable for us, but to actually do that work of listening. And that is available to us. There are many ways and places that we can do that, but we need to actually make the effort to do that, in part because of what I said before, which is that Palestinians are systemically cut out of our community conversations on Israel-Palestine. So not only do we have to do the work to actually go and find them because they're cut out of our community conversations, we need to do work to actually be able to hear them when we invite them.
Wow. Thank you so much, Sarah Ann. I am really excited to ask both of you the question of, like, what now? Where do you see this going? And we've talked about a bunch of different trends that are happening simultaneously in terms of the conversation getting more polarized, more fractured, more dispersed. Institutions still have hegemony. Are they losing it? How much? How quickly? The right is employing more extreme tactics and using different legal mechanisms and like massive scales of funding in elections, turning to new strategies as they sort of lose control over the communal conversation. Where do we see all this heading, and how might the balance of power be shifting in the Jewish community over the next several years and beyond? Dov, I'll kick it to you if you're willing to start.
Okay, big question as well. So in terms of, I want to just pick up on something that Sarah Ann just said, because I think she's absolutely right in mentioning the point about the ways in which anti-Semitism is being deployed in concerns, very, very real, legitimate concerns about anti-Semitism being deployed in this conversation around Israel and to circumscribe it. I don't think it's about so much suppression of all criticism of Israel. I think really what we're seeing more specifically in terms of the kind of the connection between this discussion and concerns around anti-Semitism and Israel-Palestine is the issue about anti-Zionism. I think clearly it is not, what is being identified as anti-Semitic is not criticism of Israel. What they attempt to codify is that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitic. So I do think that, so that does leave space for criticisms of Israel, some criticisms of Israel. It's actually a recognition in a way that there's now an acceptance that you can criticize Israel, but only so far. And so I think the real debate now is this focus on anti-Zionism. And I think that will continue to become even more of an issue in the years to come, precisely because, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, I think the debate, the issue today, the increasing concern is no longer around, quote unquote, the occupation and the future of the West Bank and Israel's presence there, but about the nature of Israel as a state and Zionism and the meaning of Zionism, and what does it mean to be a Jewish state, and can it be democracy, and all of these questions. So I think the question of anti-Zionism, which was a question, of course, that was once very important for Israel's establishment, then essentially, by the end of the 1950s, it kind of largely died, except very much on the fringes of the American Jewish community. That is now becoming increasingly the big question, and it's a question that is not separate in these debates, in this discussion, from the issue of anti-Semitism. And I'm particularly worried, and it's the subject of what I hope will be my next book, of the convergence of these two issues, of anti-Semitism and the debate around Israel, Palestine, and anti-Zionism. So I think that's where things are going. And I think, in other words, that we're increasingly, when we're talking about Israel, Palestine, we're talking about anti-Semitism, vice versa, and it becomes even harder in some ways to have a conversation, because the stakes now are so intense. It's not just the future well-being of Jews and Palestinians in Israel, Palestine, but actually Jewish security here in the United States. And so I think that's intensified the stakes. In terms of where I think things will shift, I think Sarah Ann's right to talk about the backlash, and we're certainly seeing that. I think, again, it's been happening for some time. Where I don't really see the balance of power shifting, decisively in one direction or another. I see it, if anything, the only thing I think is weakening is the center. So I think we're seeing, a strengthening of the left. Sarah Ann already mentioned there's a real kind of renaissance, if you like, of Jewish leftism and not just about Israel, Palestine, but on many other issues. And I think that will continue. And we're seeing a strengthening of the right. And this is not just happening within Jewish politics, of course. This is happening, it's really, Jewish politics is in some ways a microcosm of American politics at large, and influenced by many of the same trends. And what's weakening, therefore, what is losing is the center, and the organizations that once claimed to represent the center, and they are being increasingly challenged. So I think polarization is really going to continue within the Jewish American communities and within American politics at large.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you both for fielding the big questions. I think we're all really, really appreciative of your willingness to take them on at this level. Sarah Ann, same question to you. And also what I'll say is, while we're all waiting for Dov's next book, if you want to dive into the anti-Semitism question further, the previous panel in this series was specifically about some of those trends, and definitely would recommend it. Anyway, Sarah Ann, I'll pass to you.
Thanks. Also definitely recommend that last panel. It was excellent. I think 3 points I want to make. 2 are negative and scary and ominous, and then 1 is positive and exciting, and will hopefully juice us up for going out from here. But I want to respond first to what Dov said about the anti-Semitism issue being focused on anti-Zionism, which I agree with, and I think that that's true. And we see this. Jonathan Greenblatt, just from the ADL, just said very explicitly, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, full stop. Always anti-Semitism. This is obviously extremely dangerous, and I think in so many ways absurd and very problematic, and something that we need to push back on. And one of the ways that I always address this kind of conversation when I'm actually having it is to ask someone to define what they mean by Zionism and define what they mean by anti-Zionism, because generally people are not talking about the same things when they're talking about what they're for or what they're against. And we always have to start with definitions and shared understandings. But Dov, I am going to push back on you also, because when we are in, and I love talking to Dov because we agree on so much, and then there are these small places where we don't, and it's always illuminating to see how we're interpreting things differently. But the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which is the definition that is now being so widely codified, includes an example of anti-Semitism that is this, I'm quoting: denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination, for example, by claiming that the existence of a state of Israel is a racist endeavor. And I think that it is very possible to understand that example as saying that calling Israel an apartheid state is automatically, a priori, going to be anti-Semitic. And that takes away from us such an important tool that we need to describe a state in which there is a very clear division between who has rights and who has fewer rights, according to what are not racial groups, but are racialized groups. And so we need to be able to talk about apartheid and to talk about the ways in which the state of Israel is an apartheid state without having that conversation automatically be deemed out of bounds because we're being anti-Semitic to talk about it. So I wanted to add that to what Dov said. And I know you're dying to answer, Dov, but I'm going to give my other points first, if I may. Okay. So Eva asked, like, what's next or where we're going. So there are two things. One is that back to this issue of anti-Semitism, and I agree with Dov that this is what the conversation is. This is where we're going. And this portends for us all a loss of our rights here. It's a loss of our rights to free speech. The codification of the definitions of anti-Semitism, which go hand in hand with the laws against the what are called the anti-BDS laws, which are the laws that are being used to prevent government contracts with anyone who supports boycott, divestment, or sanctions against Israel in one way or another. Those laws themselves are actually a form of quashing, of removing our right to free speech. And these laws and the fights against them are making their way now through the courts and through different state legislatures. We are facing a very serious crisis of threats against free speech. Israel-Palestine is ground zero for this, so the conversation around Israel-Palestine. But it's not only Israel-Palestine. These laws are actually model laws that are now being used for other political issues. For instance, climate change and guns, such that it will soon, it looks like, if the laws stand, be possible that if you use your free political speech to speak out against climate change, to boycott certain companies that are contributing to climate change, you could face repercussions for that. You will have lost some of your rights to free speech. We will not have the right to boycott as part of the right of free speech in this country. That's what's on the table for us. And that is, I think, really important. That's one piece. The other bad news is that what's happening on the ground in Israel-Palestine is deteriorating quickly. It's getting worse and worse all the time. It is horrifying. And I don't know if anyone watched the news just today to see the settlers who spent 5 million shekels that they raised over the last, I don't know what amount of time, out in the open to establish a number of illegal outposts today. Out in the open, announced it ahead of time, said they were going to do it, and went and did it as a part of their efforts to just continue this very hungry machine of guzzling up Palestinian land. And we are watching this happen. We are watching the expulsions of Palestinians from their lands in Masafer Yatta, forcible transfer in Masafer Yatta in the South Hebron Hills. This is going to continue. This is happening on the ground. It's separate from the way that we talk about Israel-Palestine here, but we absolutely need to move beyond just having our conversations about what's happening here to return the focus to what's happening there, which is horrifying. So those are the two really bad things. But the really good thing, I think, is that we're here, that we're having this conversation, that it is a rich conversation, that we know, and I think, I don't know everyone who's on the call, but I'm looking at the faces who are looking back at me now on Zoom, and I see people who I think have probably been in this struggle or in these questions for some amount of time, for many years, have witnessed the generational changes that Dov has been talking about. And you know, because we know that there is a cost, a personal cost, a community cost to seeing and taking seriously and engaging with these questions around Israel-Palestine, to engaging with Palestinian rights and Israeli violations of Palestinian rights. I imagine people on this call have paid that price with your families and with your friends and maybe beyond that. And yet here you are, still engaged, still engaging, because I think and I hope what we are creating together is rich enough, can sustain you enough can sustain all of us enough that we are actually creating this new, this different, this rights-oriented, justice-oriented Jewish community. And for that, I am so grateful to be here. And I think that that is where we are heading, to more and more authentic and true and justice-oriented and looking occupation and apartheid in the eye Jewish community. That's what we're, I hope, doing today, and that's where we're going.
Thank you so much for both of you for your answers to, again, this really big question, and both the attempt to accompany like challenging trends or discouraging trends, also with some hopeful aspects as well. I know we said we'd have time for audience questions, and I think what I want to do is combine a couple of questions about specific trends and sort of add a couple of other data points into sort of the mix of the current conversation that you both are having about where we're headed. So there are two things that I want to add in. Number one, one audience member mentioned that there are 25% of American Jews who believe Israel is an apartheid state, and 38% of Jews under 40, which was also in that Jewish Electorate Institute poll. You both have mentioned in different ways the circumscription of the conversation, and also different trends in what American Jews believe, and specifically what younger American Jews believe. And I'm curious if specifically the conversation about apartheid is something you might be able to speak to. And then also, not quite related, but definitely related to the overall theme of this, which is that someone asked that there are wealthy Jewish donors who have universal sympathies and would support Palestinian rights, and theoretically should have just as much power in American politics as members of the Jewish community who are donating sums of money on the right. And the question was, why don't they seem to have any clout? Why are our communal institutions and the communal conversation in Jewish communal politics so controlled by the right, when there are Jewish donors with wealth on the left? Those are a couple of different trends, one about public opinion, one at the really grassroots and one at the donor level. And I'm curious if in what seem to probably have to be your closing remarks, if you want to add those both into the mix. And Dov, I can pass to you if you're up for it.
Okay, so on the question of apartheid, I think the mere fact that this has now entered the conversation and that there is now, serious discussion. Obviously, this isn't a new claim. This is a claim that Palestinian organizations have been making for decades. And more recently, of course, major international human rights organizations. I'm not going to get into the veracity of the claim or not. That's, a much bigger issue. But I think the mere fact that people are seriously addressing this, and that 25%, according to that, in that survey of young American Jews believe that's true, I think is clearly indicative of where things are going, how far left, if you like, the conversation is shifting in some areas. That it's not about, and it's interesting in that, specifically on apartheid, it's not even simply is Israel's rule in the West Bank apartheid, which I think is personally a stronger case to make than the whole of Israel. It's actually just apartheid state. And I think this, when we talk about these things, apartheid state is not actually, doesn't really make sense. It's a crime of apartheid. We're talking international law. I think we need to be specific when we use these terms. People to kind of throw around apartheid state. That's not actually, at least in international law, that's meaningless. It doesn't actually exist. What exists is a crime of apartheid, which is defined. And I think we have to, when we have a conversation around that, which is a conversation to have, we need to be able, as Sarah Anne was saying, define our terms and be careful how we use them. But the fact that that has entered the discussion, I think, is indicative of the shift that's taking place, and a shift that goes beyond just the future of the West Bank and Gaza. Why aren't liberal or left-wing donors, why aren't they as involved? Because they're donating to many other issues. I mean, it's the single issue problem. Like, if you are on the left, you're more universalist, you're likely to be supporting many other issues. Frankly, I think there's a good reason why you would, right? I mean, climate change for one, and in American politics, there's so many issues that are demanding people's attention and financial support. So it's completely understandable why many Jews on the left, liberal, wealthy American Jews, are putting their money in that direction. It's much more of the kind of more particularistic, those who are focused really on Jewish needs and Jewish security, and particularly in a kind of fearful manner, that I think tends to lead them to put much more money and donations into the Jewish community. I think that's an inbuilt, I can't really see that changing, because it's built into the very understanding of Jewish politics, the universalists versus more particularists. Particularists are going to spend more on Jewish issues, on Jewish causes, and particularists tend to be more on the right than on the left.
Which is an excellent point, Sarah Ann. I'll let the trade-off is you get to have the last word, but it has to be brief.
It'll be very brief, because I agree with everything that Dov just said, and that is, and if go read Peter's article from last week's Jewish Currents, where he also talks about how the left-wing donors are giving to many more causes. We have many more priorities. And so I'll make the last word be that we know that the people on the right are actually affiliated and invested not just in Israel, though they're giving so much to Israel, but also have broader investments in restricting our rights to free speech and in restricting the work that we're trying to do to save ourselves from climate change and to increase rights across the board. So actually our struggle is so completely Jewish and also broader, both at the same time. That'll be my last word. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you to you both. Yeah, just really appreciated this conversation. Earlier in the chat, someone asked for action items, and someone was like, okay, great, I hear the problems, but I want to know what we can do. And I'm an organizer, and normally, at the end of a call, there's a phone bank or something that you can join to translate everything you just heard into action. But I think I want to speak back to some of the trends that both of our speakers highlighted about institutions and organizations having an outsized role in the voice that our community has in our politics. I want to make a pitch for affiliating and engaging, we can put links to both support Jewish Liberation Fund, which supports many of the organizations that are causing this renaissance in sort of lefty American Jewish life right now, in the chat, and also, if not now, is in the middle of our membership drive. We are a newly intergenerational organization. We're led by young people, but we're for American Jews of all ages, and so really encouraging folks to become a member of If Not Now. In keeping with the massive themes of the questions that I asked tonight, there's no real one action item that could address the scale of the crisis, but it's been shown that becoming part of organizations and engaging deeply in that way over sustained periods of time is one of the ways to really contribute to overall societal change. So thank you so much. There's info about both of those in the links for folks who are asking questions. And again, thank you so much to our panelists and to Jewish Liberation Fund and to all of you for joining. Really appreciate it. Have a wonderful rest of your night. Thanks.